whenever he comes to Adelaide, one of the opening questions is, how's that Rucci going? I still don't know after all of these years why he got kicked out of New York by Rupert, but that's probably an inappropriate question for me to ask. I'm hoping perhaps somebody might pose the question a little later on. He is a quite brilliant writer who manages to upset just about everybody on a fairly regular sort of a basis. So no wonder the Advertiser consider him to be an important part of their daily newspaper. I know that Radio FIVEaa consider him to be a very important asset too, because he just manages to upset everybody. I know that when he comes to visit, when Anne invites him to tea, I emphasise when Anne invites him to tea, I only make one stipulation, and that is that the taxi pull up 2 doors down the road so the cabbie doesn't know who my friends are. Would you please give a rotary welcome to Mr. Michelangelo Rucci, who joins us now.
Thank you, Tony. Look forward to the next cab ride. Thank you everyone for the invitation today. Believe me, the way the week has already begun, this little oasis for the next few hours, believe me, is just perfect for me. And at a wine centre. How good is that? Now Tony's told me, believe me, Tony is actually one of my mentors, my confidants, my advisor. His lawyer will now send me another legal note saying that I've defamed him, but such is life. He's always said, you must know your audience. So while you're all gathered here, I'm going to ask this question. Who among you is a Crows supporter? Oh dear. That's a fair few too many people to offend, so one's gone. Who is a Port Adelaide? God has blessed you, but still again, there's not enough mates in the room, so that one goes. Who's an Essendon supporter? Yeah, well, my lawyer did warn me about you, so that one goes. Gee, that's a considerably shorter speech now, isn't it? Neil Craig's finally had his moment against me. He'll be asking somewhere around Australia now, let's see if you've got a plan B. Well, they tell me that a picture will tell you a million words, so let's see what happens when we do this. This is going to be a picture show recapping the AFL season as we lived it. There he is, the star of the show. James Hird turned up in the summer at Winter Hill thinking his team was going to take the next step. Bear in mind they were second on the ladder at about round 15, round 16. That grin on his face. We got to the pre-season. Brisbane won. Michael Voss didn't last the year. Funny thing, the pre-season, isn't it? James Hird gets into February saying, nothing to worry about. Thumbs up to everyone. Port Adelaide won the first showdown. James became a bit worried by the time April had come to be. Surprise, surprise. Port Adelaide kept winning. Amazing year for the boys at Albion. James started to look a little worried by May. Gary Ablett, in the middle of the season, was turning it up so much that he had the Brownlow medal on a lock. Well, so we thought. James was really worried by June, very worried. Fremantle. I must tell you all that in all the years that I went to Subiaco Oval to watch Fremantle, I kept notes because in the end I threatened to actually sue the Fremantle Football Club for mental torture. Didn't they change that story? Now James is really, really worried. There's another bloke at AFL House who started to get worried. James is really worried. Port Adelaide won the second showdown. I'll tell you what, I remember that grand fight, which was defined as rope-a-dope, but did Port Adelaide redefine that one in showdowns this year? Twice coming from what we would call near impossible positions. Now, Mrs. Hurd's come onto the scene. Now, wouldn't it be remarkable if the whole story was told about how James went home at some stage in March and his wife, who is in the legal profession, said, "James, don't admit to anything." Hawthorn won the flag. Yeah, they won the flag. And at this stage, James has gone on a long holiday. That's it. That's the season. Now, you can tell that it's a very, very long year. And people keep saying to me at the moment, "Oh, you're about to go on holidays, aren't you?" You're absolutely kidding, aren't you? The thing that's been so extraordinary about this year is I always remember what one of those wise men on the subs table at the old Advertiser, some of you will remember the old Advertiser, said to me, he said, "Son, on the front page, we seem to have a record of all of man's disasters, and you're very lucky because you're working on the back page where they're all of men's success stories." Geez, we had a lot of footy on the front page this year, didn't we? So it all begins in February. There's a summer of turmoil across the AFL. Adelaide, Melbourne and Essendon. Now they're three pretty big clubs. Adelaide is the biggest in this state, Melbourne is the oldest in the world, Essendon is one of the big franchises in a national league. And what we've learnt through the three sagas, Adelaide with the salary cap, third-party agreements with a chap called Kurt Tippett, Melbourne with the tanking issue of 2009 and Essendon with the supplement saga, is you need a fair bit of evidence. A weight of evidence will determine where you sit in the AFL judgment hall. And the thing we have learned is never put anything in writing. That's what Adelaide did. They put everything in writing and they were dead to rights by the time they confessed to the AFL about their Kurt Tippett saga. Every email, every cheque, every bit of the contract was there. There was nowhere to run for Adelaide. The Demons were another story altogether. We all know they tanked. We saw it. Their players knew it. Brock McLean was able to actually discuss it on the couch, which led to the investigation in Melbourne. And the weight of evidence comes down to this. Chris Connolly, as the football director, walks into the Melbourne coaching room as they're all gathered, including a young physiotherapist who's there, I think, in his first month. And Chris Connolly says, as 7 people testified to the AFL, if you don't start losing, you'll all lose your jobs. If there's one mistake Dean Bailey made at the end of that, was he should have gone back to his office, got on the office email and sent one to Cameron Schwab saying, "I've just had Chris Connolly say this to me. Is this a club directive, one that I must follow, or is it one that Chris Connolly has just thrown at us to make an impression?" Because the beauty of that is, once he had the email, he would have been actually in a position to defend himself. Instead, he gets 16 weeks on the sidelines. And the AFL's in a fair bit of difficulty in actually proving the case against Melbourne. So in the end, again, another bring the gate. What was the line? Acting in something like interests that weren't... No, behaviour that wasn't in the interest of the game. It's a nice little catch law. Essendon, we all think, we all imagine, we all have this thought of exactly what did happen. The saddest thing about Essendon is there is no genuine record of what happened at their football club this year. And the saddest thing about that one is, how do you go to your players and say, this is what we did to you? They still do not know. That is the great crime that happened at Essendon this year. They relied on trust. They told their players, we are going to do this to get a competitive edge. Please sign this form so you don't tell anyone about it, and roll up your sleeve. To be able, a year and a half later, still not tell every player what was put into their body is one of the great shames of our season. February also brought in the Australian Crime Commission report on where Australian sport is. And I would dare say there would be a fair few in this room who would say, gee, February 7, that headline, the darkest day in Australian sport, was that overcooked? Was it a political stunt by an alien government trying to deflect attention? Because of where I've been and what I've seen, I don't have that cynical view that all of a sudden Julia Gillard sat in the lodge one day and said, "Can someone create another headline, please?" And then all of a sudden the Attorney General and the Minister for Sport stand up in Canberra one day and make us fear that Australian sport's in a very bad position. And I'm still not sure that we have a government that understands where Australian sport maybe is or where it could be. I'm not sure that ASADA, as our drug authority, is actually a genuine cop on the beat to catch the drug cheats. And look, drugs is a long curse in sport. We've all seen it for, well, since the point that Raylene Boyle should have won a gold medal at Munich and didn't. And still, we know that she was a drug-free athlete against those who were juiced up from the Soviet Union and East Germany. The one issue I don't think we fully understand in Australia, because we have been the lucky country, is what corruption can do to sport. It's the old story. You bring in more and more money, there is more outside influences wanting to affect a result. And if I can just give you a personal tale where I've actually seen what money does to sport and what sort of corruption it brings in, and what's pretty well an advisory story about what could happen in Australia, is that every year around November I disappear to a little mountain village in the middle of Italy. Down the road is a village with 5,000 people. Now, what can we compare it to here? It might be Narracourt. Could you imagine Narracourt all of a sudden one day having a team that plays in the SANFL? If we had a promotion relegation system and the SANFL was the second tier across Australia, so there they are, they've risen to the SANFL, one step ahead away from the AFL competition. Well, that's what this little soccer team in the village down the road from me did. You know, it's 5,000 people in the village. It is economically the poorest part of Italy. Unbelievably poor. And all of a sudden, they have a team in the second division playing with millionaires. And there's a chap who's in the United States. He's on a flight going to Los Angeles where he was being offered a multi-million-dollar contract to actually write a book and a screenplay about the O.J. Simpson trial. And as he's on the plane, he's picked up one of the London papers. It might have been the Times, it might have been the Daily Telegraph, and he was reading in there just a little small paragraph story about how this team called Castel di Sangro had risen from obscurity to play in the Italian second division. He thought, this is remarkable. He had been to Italy for the 1990 World Cup, had fallen in love with the game and so forth, and thought on the plane, no, I'm not going to do the O.J. Simpson story. I'm actually going to go and take a year, live in this little Italian village and see how this team performs and how this happens. He titled the book The Miracle of Castel di Sangro. Towards the end of the season, the book takes a dramatic turn because he becomes aware of just how this team was formed. And at this point he's invited on the team trips, he's on the bus, he's on the flights, he's in the change rooms. And the moment of change comes about the second to last week of the season in a game in Bari. At this point, Castel di Sangro has had the miracle. They've actually survived in the second division. They've got enough points, they can't win the championship, they can't be relegated. Bari's in a different position. They actually need at least a draw to be elevated to the national top series. To cut the long story short, in the end what happened was that the president of Bari comes in to see the president of Castel di Sangro and offers him virtually $3 million in our money, and they come up with a script for how the game's to go. 1-1-1, 2-1, 2-2, 3-3, end of story. He sits there and he cannot stomach it, and he changes the whole theme of his book for the last 60 pages. The point of that all is, why do we think that that's not going to happen to us? We've just seen it now in Victoria where a very small soccer club fixed a heap of games for some Singapore bookmakers. That's why we have to be extremely vigilant. We can't believe forever and ever that this is just going to be the lucky country, that James Hird isn't going to happen again. that the game isn't going to be corrupted by bookmakers or people wanting to fix a result. The big question is, how do the fans feel? How do you feel about the game at this point? A year in, and this would have to be the AFL's equivalent of Queen Elizabeth's line, Arnis Horribilis. There's been no damage to membership. That actually grew this year. Football attendances. We got 100,000 to the grand final. Now I compare that the night before, South Sydney, one of the great clubs of New South Wales Rugby League, draws only 45,000 to a preliminary final where they were aiming to be in their grand final for the first time in 20 years. It's a great story. They were playing Manly, another great club, 45,000. There is a sport that has taken hit after hit after hit. How many hits can the AFL take? Today you'll all be thinking, well, there's another hit today with Buddy Franklin. Probably not, but it will hit us. But it probably needs some conditioning in our mind to think, well, hang on a minute, Buddy Franklin has just gone from Hawthorn to Sydney. Bucket load of money. Is it really that new? Ron Barassi did it from Melbourne to Carlton. And that's why I find it so rich that today, two of the biggest clubs running around making the biggest argument against the Swans is Collingwood and Carlton. Does anyone remember how Carlton got Chris Judd from West Coast? Apparently he's supposed to be some sponsor or spokesman for a company called Vizzy. Funny how it is that his commercial agreement in the last year is now in Carlton's injury payments. Apparently speaking for Vizzy hurts your tongue. Collingwood. How could Collingwood argue with Sydney about taking players? There's a heap of Swans who suddenly finished up at Collingwood with raids. There's a guy called Darren Jolly who became a premiership ruckman from the Swans. And Hawthorn. Geez, I'd love to be in the Hawthorn boardroom right now. Pity Jeff Kennett's not there because this will be interesting. They could fire back about Buddy Franklin, but do we want to remember they pinched Sean Burgoyne by talking to him in season, Jack Gunston by talking to him in season, Josh Gibson by talking to him in season, David Hale by talking to him in season? It's the way of the game. It's probably what we're going to have to get used to. It's business, it's their profession, they'll take the money and run. I always remember what Jerry Seinfeld said when I was in New York and talked about free agency, which is that process of you spend a bit of time with a footy club, you earn up, not even the long service, and you're allowed to move on to somewhere else. And Jerry used to say, come the end of the season, the team would send out the shirts to the laundry and you just wonder what would come back. Number 23 is not coming back to Hawthorn. So how does the AFL look today? We saw Andrew Demetre, who looks pretty stern at the moment. There's no doubt, and he admits it, that he reacted far too late to what was happening at Essendon. I can remember about May 2012, because it's 2012, there was a function in Adelaide. It was related to someone of long standing in SA football, I've forgotten, who was retiring, and Andrew Demetre and Mike Fitzpatrick and a few of the other AFL heavies. That's right, it was Bob Hammond. Bob Hammond was leaving the commission. So they had come to town. At the same time, there was a fair bit of issue with Adelaide and Matt Randell. And I had a moment with Mike Fitzpatrick at one of the hotels on North Terrace, and he was telling me about the concern they were having with sports scientists. There was one Melbourne club, it wasn't Essendon. From my guess of the way he was speaking, it was actually the Western Bulldogs. They had their sports scientist there was beginning to overrule the doctor. Could you ever imagine that? Some sports scientist who has had none of the training in terms of what is right for an athlete medically overruling a doctor. And they were considerably concerned. And I know that Andrew Demetre in the following weeks, there's a famous session up in Brisbane where he hit the lines about, if anyone crosses this line, expect an enormous hit from the AFL. And one of the lines he used was we're tired of seeing guys with suntans in the middle of winter. I should get you some of the photographs of what James Hird looked like in the middle of 2012. We'll leave that to be. Funny thing is that at the moment, one of the most vocal people who is on radio, was certainly last night, is Adrian Anderson. He's the former football operations manager at the AFL, and he's having a fair bit to say at the moment. It's funny because under Adrian's watch there was the Kurt Tippett contract that he refused to look at again and again, no matter how many times we prodded him saying, Adrian, are you sure this Kurt Tippett contract's the real deal? No problem at all, we've looked at it fine. Funny how that was. Essendon happened under his watch. Melbourne happened under his watch. I would have thought of all the people, good old Adrian would have been very quiet at the moment. He had a nice hit up about the city of Adelaide as well. Strange. Essendon. So where is Essendon today? James Hird comes back on August 25 next year. I can't believe it. One, that on the very night that he's hit with a 12-month ban, Essendon rubs the whole thing back into the AFL Commission face by announcing he's got a 2-year extension to his contract. Can you imagine anywhere in any form of life, business, or even a cultural society that we have today, that you could put your organisation in such deep trouble that you'll be rewarded with a contract extension? It's just extraordinary. I do wonder about Paul Little, the club chairman. I think he is a man who is blinded by his hero worshipping of James Hird. It is always sad when a club becomes inferior to an individual. It's the old story, no one should be bigger than a footy club. David Evans is the former chairman. I feel extremely sorry for him. One, he did cause his own problem by having they went out of their way, Essendon, to convince James Hird to coach. And then they just let him run the show. Without good governance, without control of what is happening in your football club, they have had the disaster that they've had this year. And unfortunately, David has paid a considerably heavy price, not only in his standing in football, but also to his health. He is another one of those victims at Essendon. It's not a great picture, is it? I mean, we look at it, it should have been one of the great years of the AFL, and it wasn't. But there were some good things. And I know we would have to work through all the mire of what was Essendon, Adelaide and Melbourne to actually find that there were some shining moments. One is clearly Port Adelaide. Gee, what a model that is, eh? Put the right people in the right jobs, let them do it without interference, and you get success. Gee, wonder where they found that idea. Gold Coast, you have to admire that they're making some progress. Compared to Greater Western Sydney, the Gold Coast model seems to be effective. And what do we all think of Gary Ablett today? There is a young man who not only went to a new club with a deal he couldn't refuse, but he doesn't appear to be a player who actually plays for the money. Sacrifices a lot of himself for what is in the good of his teammates and his football club. Not sure we can say that for many others. And of course we've had Jeremy Howe. Just so many times he just rises into the sky to take some great marks, to actually give our game something exciting. Gee, I wish Jeremy Howe was playing for Fremantle at the weekend. We might have actually enjoyed that grand final. So where are we going? This is actually the anniversary, as Tony pointed out, 20th anniversary when I left New York. There is a famous line about what happened in that office with Rupert Murdoch when I looked at him and I said, Rupert, there are 3 airports here, LaGuardia, Kennedy or Newark. Which one do you want me to leave from? Always give them a choice, I say. One of my last assignments was at one of the great sporting venues that I know of, Fenway Park in Boston. I don't know if many of you have ever been to Boston and seen Fenway. It is a cathedral of old sporting architecture. They actually have red bricks in the stadium. Minimal concrete, but a lot of red bricks. And the boys who had known me for 5 years had actually put together a parcel of books as a farewell gift. And the line was, don't read them all at once, don't read them, in succession, but pick them out one by one as you go along, because you will find, because I had been telling them stories about Australian football and its growth into a national competition, they said, you will find that a lot of the lessons in these books that they had written about either the Yankees, the Red Sox, Vince Lombardi and so forth, who were great legends of American sport, would actually unfold in Australia. It would be all about the consequences of money, inequality in sport, and the greatest evil of all, and that is ego. And a lot of people, once you hear that word ego, begin to have some images in your own mind about AFL football, and I'm sure that one of them will will come up in the question time, is about Andrew Dimitri. This has been his decade. He took over from Wayne Jackson at the end of the 2004 Grand Final. It was a great Grand Final run by Port Adelaide. He had an organisation that had $175 million in annual revenue. Today he's running an organisation that banks in $430 million. You can now see why he earns almost $2 million a year as the head of the AFL. He does actually run an organisation that is big business. And the question you've always got to ask is, with that growth, what is the cost? The game is under greater, not partnership, but perhaps control with its TV partners. You pay $1 billion, you expect something in return. The corporates are huge. And every corporation, and I love David Koch's line when he started at Port Adelaide saying, you can't go to people anymore and say, give us $1 million to sponsor us. They've got to go back to boardrooms and say, what are you delivering in return? And when it's about delivering in return, it's interesting what sort of demands are placed on you. And we have the players. I think after the Buddy Franklin moment of last night, we don't need to discuss too much more about the players. Is there a moment this year that I've enjoyed? Oh yeah, a couple of showdowns. They were good fun. And I keep thinking, is there a story I can leave you with that actually gives you a laugh about how good AFL footy can be? How much that little larrikin, that rogue, not the rogue like the one we saw up here earlier, just the one who does something outside of the box. And I always love the story about Martin Pike. He was playing at North Melbourne. Martin Pike's an extraordinary story, local kid from Karaka, I believe, or that area there. Multi-premierships with Brisbane and one with North Melbourne. And it is the classic Dennis Pagan regime at North Melbourne of demand more, because the more that you put in, as Ken Eckley said this year, the more you deserve at the end. It was Christmas. It was the era of finally they could get GPS monitors on players. They would strap them on and they would sit on the front and they would measure your heart rate so you'd actually work out how much work you'd put in. And Dennis Pagan had given the players 2 weeks off, but it wasn't really 2 weeks off. It was a compulsory break over Christmas, New Year. Here was a training program. You had to follow it, bring the GPS monitors back, we put them in the computers and measure. They all come back, Martin Pike hands his in, and he won every category. Best heart rate, best effort, all that sort of stuff. And at the end of the first session back, which was January 7, he's driven back home by one of his teammates, excuse me for forgetting his name, and he goes, Martin, not on, that's impossible, we know what you're like. There's no way you could have done all that. And ultimately Martin confessed that he would go out to the local reserve with his dog, strap the GPS on his dog, get a tennis racket and ball and keep hitting it up and down. You've got to love him, don't you?
We've got time for 2 questions. Phil.
I've been out of the country for a while, but I'd be interested to know where the Drug Commission stands on all this football issue. Are they going to ever take any action or just keep yapping in the background?
Phil, it's the greatest question of all, and one of the unfortunate things is I'm not sure that we have an Australian Sports Anti-Doping Authority that actually has enough invested in it, enough people involved in it to be on top of this. It's the classic case of every time an athlete goes down the wrong path, the drug cops, as we call them, are so far behind. You know, there is a cheat and it takes a long time. Look at the Lance Armstrong case. I don't know if you read Patrick Smith in The Australian, but the day after the new federal government was put in place and there was a new sports minister who's dividing half his time between sport and health, there's a great column by Patrick Smith pretty well saying, look, just like you've noted, this is a serious issue and we really should have people 100% focused on it. I'm not sure the penny's dropped. I would have hoped after the Essendon saga and all that's involved in the NRL, we would be saying, particularly when we've been on a pedestal for a long time, taking some heavy hits to other countries, that we would be even more vigilant. And it's not just about the drugs. The corruption aspect is going to be frightening if we're not in control of what's happening, particularly with gambling. That is going to lead so many awful moments in sport, believe me.
Attorneys and guests, we normally present our guest with a video and a pen, and we'll do that. We took up a collection yesterday, you might remember, and we thought, what could we get Michelangelo that he would enjoy on the plane to Tuscany? And I thought a pillow while he's sleeping, or perhaps a crow's jumper. And on the back it's got good riddance. So, attorneys and guests,